Summary of the ACT Chess Association online Blitz event, which was held last night on leechess.org. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association while the Canberra clubs are still in lockdown, and I then do a summary the following day of some of the more interesting highlights from these tournaments. But some slightly good news from the ACT here. It looks like barring any unforeseen circumstances, we might be opening up shortly, middle of October for the first set of openings up. End of October 29th seems to be a more important date. We may be able to get back to some face-to-face chess then, including street chess. But last night was a 9-round Blitz event, played with 5 minutes flat, and was absolutely dominated by Amir Malik, who won the tournament with 9 out of 9. Wasn't in trouble for a lot of the tournament. There were a couple of games where he might have slipped up, but no, he held it all together and finished way out in first place. But the game I am going to show is for earlier round, not involving the winner, but a couple of players between Connor and... I've got to click my right button here to get the game up now. Connor and Grace Tones. And in the end, Connor did quite well, finished, I think, 5 out of 9, which is a good score. He's one of our promising junior players. And Grace Tones is a little bit new to the chess scene, but also playing quite well. Now, there are a couple of interesting things in this game all the way through, but the main thing, and I'm going to get to it later, is the Greek gift. And I'll explain, if you've not seen that before, I'll explain what that is. If you have seen it before, and I've probably covered it before at least once, this is an example of you've just got to be slightly careful. But let's kick off with e4, c5, c3 Sicilian, very popular anti-Sicilian system, and not a bad system if you know what you're doing. Knight c6 isn't the most challenging move here. Either an immediate d5 or an immediate knight f6 are both moves that should be played. So d4, c takes, c takes. And what you've got in this position already is an ideal pawn center for white, because the two pawns on e4 and d4 cover the c5, d5, e5, and f5 squares, which makes it very difficult for black to develop sensibly. And white has also got now both bishops can come out and both knights can come out. And this is actually a fantastic position for white out of the opening, as long as you can hold your center. Now, I'll just give you just a quick horrible example of, for example, if you try and fight back with a move like this, we kind of see something like this. Now, by the way, I'm going to show you a few lines all the way through this little stream. And what I'm going to call them are obvious lines. They're not too deeply worked out. They're just, if I was just playing natural moves without thinking too hard, these are the sort of moves that we played. And it turns out that sometimes these moves are bad moves and there are better moves. But that's kind of the point, that if you just play sort of casual, relaxed, but lazy chess, sometimes you can run into trouble without realizing it. So in this position, the d pawn for black is actually a bit of a weakness at the moment. It's isolated, which means it's kind of easy to attack. So we go knight f3, say bishop b4. As I said, I'm just playing some natural moves here, knight c3. And black decides that they're going to try and wreck white's pawn structure by capturing on c3. So instead of having two pawns on a2 and b2, you've got an isolated pawn on c3. And the point about isolated pawns is because they're not defended by other pawns, they generally have to be defended by pieces. And pieces don't really care to be defending pawns. They'd rather go off and attack things. So we take and we take knight f6, bishop g5, pin and win. And if we castle, we get this situation here where white has decided to try and completely wreck black's pawn structure with basically this pawn still being, I'll make that red, this being isolated, these two pawns being isolated and double. In return, of course, this pawn's a little bit of an issue as well. But white is better in this position. It's going to be very hard for black to get the bishop off c8 without blundering away the d7 pawn. So that's just an example of if you've got some extra space in the center with the two pawns on here and here. Sometimes your opponent's attempts to break out, I suppose, or free their position end in a worse position. So we play e6, much more sensible. And knight c3 was played. Now, I think I've had this position before, or a very similar position, and I think d5 has been my choice. After take and take, knight e5, for example, I'm going to go down another lateral line here. We'll bring some pieces out. Protect the knight. We'll bring another piece out. Bishop here, pin and win. And the idea here, of course, is that you're trying to capture on f3 and force white to capture back with the pawn. Again, sticking to our theme of how to make our opponent's pawns look horrible. But white can flick in bishop e5 check. And the problem here is we don't want to move the king. We lose the right to castle if we do. Obviously, we're not going to block with the queen because we're not crazy. And you're either retreating the bishop or playing knight to d7. And then we castle. And your chance of trying to double those pawns has now disappeared. And after bishop here, h3 takes and takes. Again, white is a little bit better because white has castled. White has more space to develop their pieces. And black still needs a couple of moves before bringing all their pieces out and castling. And the pawn on d5, if it can kept there, can be slightly annoying as well. But knight c3, developing move. Not going to complain about that just yet. Knight f6. And white played knight f3 here, which is, again, a natural, sensible move. But there are a couple of choices. You could play e5 here to kick the knight. Knight d5, knight f3, in and win, of course. But after bishop d2, queen a5, and it looks like white is having to defend against black's threats. But I don't think white cares, because after this and this, white's okay. We are threatening c4 here to win a piece. Because if you play knight takes c3 here, thinking you've won a pawn, of course, you've just blundered a piece. Because of the pin with the knight on c3 by the bishop on d2, you just play queen c1 and you're picking up a piece. By the way, when you first start playing chess and you haven't played a lot of tournament chess, it's often these little tactics that kill you. You sometimes come in thinking that chess is this deep strategic game where you've got to master openings and that sort of thing, but it's often these 1-2 threats that actually do you in. So keep an eye on that. Now, back to the other choice in this position. We could play d5 and hit the other knight. And notice that this is the advantage of having those two pawns in the middle, is that at various points they can move forward and cause some issues. Again, let's just have a look at another line. Takes and takes. Knight has to move, so it goes to e5. And d6 is a good move here because it stops the bishop on c8, f8 moving. And it's really cramped black up. And if black tries to free themselves with a move like queen b6, knight b5, I know you shouldn't move the same piece twice in the opening, but the threat here is just to play knight c7, forking king and rook in the corner. You could play king d8, I suppose, to try and do something about it. The other line that you could try is knight e4. And the idea here is that, if white foolishly goes off after the rook in the corner, like this, here, 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 this is checkmate for black. Now, you might go, oh, who would be silly enough to do that? I've seen plenty of games where people are silly enough to do that, because the problem they think they're solving is to win the rook in the corner. The problem they should be solving is not getting checkmated on f2. Instead, knight e4, so we just play queen c2 here, protecting the f2 square, attacking the knight on e4, as well as keeping an eye on the c7 square. Say queen c6, and then we still get this threat carried out, king over in the corner here, and you've won the rook. It's winning for white. Just be aware that there are a couple of little tricky issues you've got to deal with, in that after knight takes here, the knight in the corner may not get out into the game, but that matters not, because even if that knight gets captured, it's still a rook for a knight. Okay, so I'm going through a lot of early opening stuff, things to keep an eye on. And there's one more before we get to the fun stuff as well. So knight f3 was played here, and this kind of allowed black to get back into the game, although black didn't take the best opportunity. Instead, e5 again, and let's just go down. Oh, I've done that line already, so I don't want to do that one. And I've done d5. So black missed their chance with d5 here. Fight back in the center. You don't want to let white's pawns run you over. And after d5, again, we get a similar line. Now, it turns out this line is kind of good for white, and it's a bit of a precursor for what we end up with later in the game, with one significant difference. And I want to highlight that as I go. So bishop to d3, pin and win. We play queen here, so we're kind of aiming for a bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes e4, just winning a pawn. Then a queen to a5. if my computer behaves itself. Queen to a5. Yep, here we go. And then I'm waiting for bishop to d2. Oh, it's now jumping around like a mad thing. Okay, so queen to a5, bishop to d2, knight takes d2. Don't be worried about this. Queen takes d2, castles, castles, takes and takes. And I'm just running down again, there are probably better moves in this position, but I'm just going down all these lines just to show you what happens if you play some natural chess. And the lesson in part here is that if your opponent is playing what seems to be natural moves, fine, they're either Capablanca or there's probably something hidden in the position that you might want to get into. Anyway, b6 is the example, and queen e2 here. Now, black can play something sensible like h6 here, and why I say it's sensible is because if they play something else, this is what happens. So, bishop d7. Now, this is the introduction to the Greek gift if you've never seen it before, but I am assuming lots of you have seen this one before. So, the idea behind the Greek gift is the bishop on d3 is going to sacrifice on h7. Then the knight on f3 is going to come to g5, followed by the queen on, in this case, the e2 square to h5. Normally the queen starts on d1 and takes that journey there. And we're going to see what happens. So bishop takes h7, king takes h7, knight g5 check. If the king retreats here, queen h5 is almost completely winning in this position. Okay, there are a couple of lines that you might want to check. I'm not going to go through them in great detail because I'll show them later. But this is just winning for white. And the idea is that the knight and the queen are unstoppable in terms of checkmating or winning massive amounts of material down this side of the board. So that's the first thing. The king can come to g6. Very brave move. And it turns out that this is the move that most people, when they make this sacrifice as white, forget about. They just assume the king's going back. Now, in this case, king g4, f5, queen g3 is still winning because you notice the king really doesn't have any squares to go to, and you are threatening lots of discovered checks in this position. Again, I will talk a little bit about this later. But way back here, when I started drawing the arrows on the board, I highlighted the pawn on e5 in red. I will come back to this because this is really important that this pawn is here. So instead, bishop b4, bishop to d2, and this was a little bit of a blunder because essentially what happens here is white now loses a pawn. Knight takes e4 here, bishop d3 takes and takes, and when we have a look at this position, white's actually lost the e-pawn. The compensation is a little bit minor here, but it did help that black then played the kind of moves that white really wanted to see. So castles, okay, first move that white wanted to see was castle. And white plays h4, and I suspect black hadn't really seen this trick before because it's kind of setting up knight g5. Because if you play bishop takes h7 in the previous line, king takes knight g5, the queen will just take the knight because it's not protected. So h4 is a bit of a sneaky move trying to protect the knight on g5. And maybe black, this should have been a warning sign for black. Now, I suspect the next tournament or the next games that black play where this happens, they will know that this is coming. So they went d5, ordinarily not a bad move, and this allowed bishop takes h7. Now, it turns out in this specific position, this sacrifice doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because there's no pawn on e5. So in that previous line I showed you, there was a pawn sitting on e5 covering the f6 square. In this line, this hasn't happened, and this is really important. So when I said at the top, the Greek gift, which this is called, sacrifice, it's a great idea for white, but it doesn't always work, and this is one of the circumstances where it doesn't work. So king takes, that's fine, knight g5, and it turned out that the king g8 move, which is generally the move that most people assume is the only move in this position, was a massive blunder. And after queen h5, white is going on to win, and I will show you that in a second. But after knight g5, king g6, remember the other idea. King g6 was the move here. Because the king can now run via f6 to e7 to safety. And that's why it was vitally important that there was a pawn sitting on e5. For example, you play queen here, king goes to f6, knight h7, king e7, knight takes f8. king takes f8. And there's no mate here. The king has happily run away. There's no checkmate. But you might say to yourself, well, you know, sure, I've sacrificed a couple of pieces, but I want a rook, and it's actually 2 pieces for a rook. But it basically turns out that the 2 pieces should win. Now, my engine just gives this as completely winning for black. I'm not going to say it is completely winning for black in a practical sense. I still think that there are good chances for white to do okay in this position, get something out of it, because basically the king is still a little bit exposed, and the h-pawn can possibly run up the board. And if black is not careful, white can play moves like queen h7 and h4, h5, h6, and try and open up the king and get the rook on h1 into the game. But this is not the outcome that white was planning on. So let's come back here. Knight g5, king g8, and this is why this is a snake. So queen h5. And the immediate threat is just to checkmate on this square. So the rook has to get out of the way to give the king a flight square. Now, white played the correct move here. This is easily a chance to go wrong. Queen takes f7. Check is the right move. If you play the immediate queen check here, king here, queen h8, king starts to run. And when you take on g7, the king is still a little bit safe. And there are a couple of lines that work here. Queen can go here, and the reason is that, okay, take here, and then we run back here. Now, in this position, there is not going to be a mate. Enough of the squares around the king are now well protected. Black is also threatening to take on c3 with check, causing some issues as well. And you can't necessarily play a move like king d2 because there's a pin on the c-pawn protecting the d-pawn. So, black is okay here, although, again, they've got to worry about some white tricks. And white still has developed more pieces, and you've just got to worry about the h-pawn and the g-pawn charging down the board. But queen takes f7 is a much stronger move, and it is a winning move here. King in the corner. Queen goes to g6, threatening the mate on h7. So the king runs again. Check again. King here. Queen h5. King g8. Now, this game was played at Blitz time limit, 5 minutes each. So I suspect what white is doing here is doing 2 things. One, just getting a few moves out of the way while thinking about what they're going to do next. And if it all goes wrong, at least they can play a move like, not queen h7, queen f7 check, which is a draw. It's a repetition in this position. It's an instant draw. White decided to play on, which was the sensible thing. But sometimes with sacrifices, if they don't work, taking a draw is no shame in doing that. So king h7, king f8, queen check, king here. And this is why taking on f7 was the winning move. In the previous line where you didn't take on f7, this wasn't check, and black had time to get themselves organised. Having got rid of the f-pawn, taking on g7, now black has to get the king out of danger. King goes to d6, and we get the knight fork now. And this is, white is again completely winning. So we've won a queen. King goes back, takes, king takes. But again, let's just count some material here. Just in case, we've got a queen and 2 pawns worth 11 points versus bishop and knight worth 6 points. So, yeah, easy win here. And it's just worth playing on in this position just to show you exactly how white wins, because there is another little lesson in here for players just to keep an eye on. So the queen goes back with check, which is just a check, brings the knight back. But white's plan here, and this is where people go wrong terribly, is they get to a position like this, and then they go, what do I do next? White knew what they were going to do, and it was just to march the h-pawn up the board. And white didn't particularly deviate from that plan unless they had to. I've seen so many people dilly-dally in this position, like, hey, maybe I can win the e-pawn for some weird reason. No, just find a good winning plan and stick to it. h5, bishop d7, h6, here we go, king c7, so that the rooks can come across. But the problem with this is twofold. One, the knight is currently hanging if the rook moves across to h8. And 2, white sensibly plays the queen check here, because what they're doing is they're guarding the h8 square. So they're going to play h7 next move, okay, and then the idea is to play h8. Now, so the king, where does the king go? So if the king goes back to d8, which happened in the game, it tends to block the rooks from coming across. King could go to c6 and h7 gets played, and the rook could come across and try and block. But in fact, c4 is also a nice move here. With the king exposed on the queen side, you're simply threatening just to go take on d5, for example, and then bring the rook into the game for check, and it will probably soon be checkmate as well. So instead, after queen a5, king d8, pawn went to h7, knight went to g6, and black thought they were doing an okay job, because next move they'll be able to capture something, okay? But then white flicked in queen f6, which is paying good attention to the position. And again, here's the problem. Either the knight's going to get captured, or the knight goes back to e7, and if the knight goes back to e7, then thank you, I've just got more queens than I know what to do with in this position, and white will just simply win quite easily. So that was from last night. There was a lot of involved stuff very early on about taking advantage of your 2 pawns in the centre. But then further on, there was a little bit of a discussion about the Greek gift here, which ironically in this game doesn't work, but at the same time, after king g8, queen h5 is a good example of what happens when it does work. Okay, good tactics practice. You Greek gifts pretty easily when you play chess. There's enough examples in the wild for you to pick up on that as well. So that was from last night's Blitz game. It was played 5 minutes each at the ACTCA online Monday night Blitz. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. And I do these summaries normally the following day. This one was a little bit late. Normally I do them in the morning, but I'm doing this around lunchtime. And I'm trying to find interesting and instructive games from each of these events to talk about this. But the other good news, as I said right at the top, is restrictions in Canberra are starting to be lifted. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks / by the end of next month, we should be back to face-to-face chess. And whether I continue these videos or not, we'll see how that works out. But until probably tomorrow, when I'll hopefully be doing a summary of the ACT Online Rapid, which is normally held on Tuesday nights, I will be seeing you later. So thanks for tuning in, and hopefully see you again.